They were extremely mature for their age, to be honest. I mean, they were, what, 17, 18 at the time. We were working with them. You know, it didn't really feel that way. You know, they were very mature as musicians, very mature as people, and, you know, they weren't very difficult to work with. You know, they believed in our plan. They believed in, you know, Dennis and my sort of work ethic.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I do this is to express how I feel. You know what I mean? It's music's what I've chosen. I could have been doing something else maybe. You know what I mean? But I think I don't think I've always wanted to communicate with other people how I feel about stuff.
I thought the album was fantastic. You know, obviously we'd been popping in and out of the studio while they were making it. But you know, I think it was the debut album they needed to make. You know, I thought it was fantastic. I think it sort of showcased where the band were at the time of their career. I think John had stretched them as much as he could. There was, you know, it had the experimental in there. It had the edge. It had a pop sensibility, and you know, I felt that it was an album that was delivered that would last the test of time. You know, we really felt that at the time. We felt very, very confident that we'd made the record, and the great pleasure was that when we delivered it to Maverick, they loved it.
Showbiz was met with a warm reception and a respectable chart positioning for a debut album at number 29. However, in some quarters, the operatic and somewhat bombastic nature of Muse's music pushed some critics away, while others chose to draw heavy comparisons to another UK act, Radiohead, not only due to their sound and style, but also because of John Leckie's connection with the band.
I produced the Ben's Radiohead, you know, it was probably about 5 years before I met Muse, so, you know, it was quite a lengthy period. And during that time, you know, I'd had lots of offers to work with a lot of bands, you know, bands, American bands particularly, who wanted to be Radiohead kind of thing. And I'd turn them down. And to be honest, Muse, I didn't really think they were like Radiohead influenced, you know. They were more into Metallica than I think Radiohead.
Can't get the stink out. He's been hanging around for days. Comes like a comet. Suck at you, but not your friends.
I think the Radiohead comparisons at the time, to be honest with you, was lazy journalism. I think there was one or two journalists who came out and said it's a little bit like Radiohead, and he sounds a bit, he's pretending to be Tom York. And I think the comparisons really, at the time I said to the boys, this is a compliment, because number one, Radiohead are a great band. You're being compared to one of the best bands around right now. And also Tom York's a great singer. And Matt, you're a fucking great singer too. So those comparisons are great.
I was actually quite surprised when the reviews came out and journalists, you know, were comparing them to Radiohead and, you know, just like dismissing them and saying, oh, they're just Radiohead copyists. And I thought it was quite sad, really.
Despite these comparisons, Muse were well on their way. From the beginning, they had always toured heavily, and on the back of their first album, Muse continued this, playing as many festivals around Europe as possible, and also venturing into Japan and the United States. However, it was something of a coup that Muse suddenly found themselves supporting two of the biggest names in American rock music at the time, the Red Hot Chili Peppers and the Foo Fighters.
When we finished Showbiz, you know, they did tours around the UK, but what Safta and Dennis did was put them out into Europe, you know, because they'd done deals with record companies, independent record companies in France and Germany and Scandinavia, and part of the deal of signing the band, licensing the record, was that they would provide tour support. What really changed them, I think, was going out to Europe, which would have been year 2000, I think, and they supported Red Hot Chili Peppers and Foo Fighters.
Well, the tour with the Red Hot Chili Peppers and the Foo Fighters came about after a show they played at the Bercy in Paris with both those bands. And they got on really well, and the bands were blown away by them, and I think they went out with Dave Grohl afterwards, who was a big hero of the band, obviously being Nirvana fans, and got hammered like for hours and hours in various places. So as a result of that, they landed the opening slot on this American tour that was about a month long.
I was amazed we got it. I mean, we really fought hard to get it. I mean, I remember a guy called Bruce Floor, who was the A&R guy for the Foo Fighters, calling me up and swearing down the phone saying, you know, I don't know how you got your band on this tour. He said, I couldn't get one of my own bands on, and Foo Fighters are my fucking band. But he said, you know, but it was a fantastic achievement to get that tour. But for the band, it was a great growing up process because, you know, here they were, you know, playing in America for the first time, playing in sheds in front of, we're talking about 20,000 people on some shows. I think it was a real learning, growing up experience.
And they came back like really different people. They were full of confidence, and you could tell that they'd been through a lot. They've kind of lost themselves. They sort of stood naked. They'd lost everything, all their clothes and everything. And from that they became strong as people. And particularly in their playing. When you saw them playing live and in the studio, it was much more stronger, more forward, more confident, and the whole thing just went up a level.
As soon as they'd finished recording Showbiz, Matthew already had probably another 50 songs in his head. And you could tell at sound checks, I used to sit in on sound checks because I always found it quite interesting, because I'd hear a new tune, because he'd be sitting there with his guitar in his hand, sort of just mumbling to himself and playing riffs, which always sounded great to me. So we were encouraging them to road test songs on the road, because number one, you'd get an audience reaction to see how well that was going down, and number two, they were crafting that song at each show. So by the time we were ready to go in to do the second album, I would say that most of that second album had already been written and road tested.
It was sort of the Showbiz period, but it was the later half of Showbiz, because towards the end of the bit that I did, we started to go into doing, they were writing songs that became Origins of Symmetry. Some of the songs that were already around in the set became Origins of Symmetry. It got quite confusing though, because for ages when they used to name songs, they used to name them things like New One and New One and New One. Like, and if those songs had different tunings, it got quite confusing, because, you had to think, right, okay, which one are we on now? Is it New One or is it New One? Like, so that kind of got a bit confusing. So, I mean, I suppose, yeah, towards the end of Showbiz and into the beginnings of Origins of Symmetry, and I believe, we did some of the, we took the gear into the studio to do some of the early demos for what became Origins of Symmetry.
But what we decided to do was to try and, break out and put them in with a different producer, just to see what else would happen. So at the time, a good friend of mine, a producer called Dave Bottrell, who's renowned for working with harder rock bands, he'd worked with Tool. So we'd approached him, and he was already a good fan of the band and made a good connection with Matt. So we put him into Ridge Farm Studios here in Dorking, England, to record 4 of the key songs: Plug-in Baby, Newborn, Dark Shines and Bliss.
What I was personally expecting was going to be a much more sort of concise sort of rock pop record, because I remember first hearing Plug-in Baby at one of the French shows quite early on in the Showbiz tour, soon after the album came out, and it was quite frustrating for me, because everyone else had thought of them as this sort of big bombastic prog band, really. And then there was this nugget song that I knew was there.
The whole album as well has a kind of harder sound than Showbiz. It's got more of a kind of rock flavour about it, really. It's almost like they know that they're getting somewhere with their sound, and they're almost like chomping at the bit. They want to do more. But there's obviously lots of interesting electronics there, and there's interesting uses of instruments like the mellotron, and there's these seeds of almost an interest in prog and psychedelia that you can kind of hear starting to come through, but it's a much more American sounding record. It's a much more rock sounding record than some of the others.
Plug-in Baby was the first taste from Muse's second album, Origin of Symmetry, and was issued in March of 2001. The song helped establish the band's harder rock credentials, as well as offering a more radio-friendly punch.